Namaste. My name is Neena Rai and I'm the author of the books Amazing Ayodhya and Adbhut Ayodhya. Today on the power table, we have Pandit Satish Sharma with us. Welcome, Panditji.
It's my pleasure, it really is.
It has become apparent that not only are they targeting a growing India, but with that, the man responsible for it, Prime Minister Narendra Modi, has been continuously being targeted. I want to understand why. Why are they so against a democratic country like India and a democratically elected leader? He is, for God's sake, the largest single democratic leader in the world. You don't come and preach his democracy. You don't call him a fascist, for God's sake. He's a democratically elected leader. How dare you?
So this is one thing that we have to learn. We have, though, at the helm of Bharat now, with an unimpeachable, unquestionable mandate,
Correct.
a person who respects himself, respects his culture. He is aware of the nobility of his ancestors.
Correct.
And he walks and talks with the garment of that nobility and that culture as his garment. That's how he walks and talks.
And I've noticed he walks and talks like an equal. He will go and speak in Hindi, and I've noticed the silly English medium type variety in our country mock him for his accents. You fools, he's done better than anybody of you have done.
You see, respect is something which we think is earned, but those who study things know that also respect is something you command.
Yes.
And you can only command respect when you yourself feel a degree of self-respect. And he embodies that.
Correct.
And I'm not aligned or a supporter of any particular party, but what I have seen is that his manner of bearing has actually given permission to Hindus all over the world and informed them they too are worthy of respect.
Correct.
Now this is a threat. If you think of another dimension to this, when Hindus go into any society...
So they are threatened by Modi, or are they threatened by us?
So he is a phenomenon.
Okay.
So consider any Hindu community in any diaspora society is prosperous, not because that community, not because that society has given us something special. Here are some Hindus, let's give them special investments, let's give them supported schooling or anything. We have nothing like that. We receive nothing from the states where we function, but we contribute toward them over and above the ratios of our population percentages. Why is that? It's because of our values. Now imagine if Hindus, people of the Sanatani family, can do that in relatively alien, hostile cultures where we don't know the languages. We don't go to a country and study its criminal and penal code and say, this is what we have to adhere to. We take our dharmic sanskars wherever we go. We adhere to those. And those dharmic sanskars are actually a higher value system than is enshrined in many of these societies. And that's why we fit in so well. And that's why we're so productive and why we contribute so much. Imagine a nation full of people who adhere to dharmic principles. Non-consumption, non-violence, non-suffering, minimum suffering, maximum of anand for everybody. Those sorts of dharmic principles, they're very simple. Imagine a nation of 1.23 billion people who have got those sanskars, creating wealth without stealing, without looting, without cheating, and with the minimum of consumption. That is a powerhouse. And what Prime Minister Modi ji has done is he's created an environment in which we can do that.
Correct.
That's all. The purpose of governance is actually to allow a community to expand, to live and thrive, and contribute a minimum amount to a government which can then impose and enforce justice and protection. That's it. That's the social contract that we have. And what Prime Minister Modi ji has done is he has done very little other than stop oppressing the indigenous people of this homeland.
Correct.
That's it.
Correct.
We are still oppressed. You know, I often say that Hindus exist in this country under a state of, frankly, what is religious apartheid.
Yes.
There's no two ways around it.
Correct.
But what he has done is he has lessened the punitive aspects of that religious apartheid.
Correct.
It's almost as though a boot has been lifted from our necks, and the indigenous people of this homeland are dusting themselves down and beginning to look up and now actually look at him and say to the world, "Hum bhi hain." Now that is a really powerful combination when you have such a youthful population, 1.2 billion dynamic people functioning under a set of values which is dharmic and therefore more natural and in harmony with each other and with everybody else and everything else. That society, when it stands up on its feet and is assured of its protection, is going to articulate its vision of civilization.
Correct.
And that's a game-changing, paradigm-shifting moment when that happens.
Okay.
And when that happens, something else will happen, is we will have the breathing space to look back at our ancestors and be able to say, this was done to us. This was taken from us. This is how we were subjected to the most inhumane atrocities.
Correct.
And only now are we being able to tell our story.
Correct.
And when that happens, all of a sudden accountability and reparations become a part of any negotiation. And the Western power structures, especially those Abrahamist power structures, fear the day when Hindus stand up and say, actually, 165 million of us were killed in an 80-year period.
Yeah.
Right? We had between 45 and 68 trillion dollars worth of wealth taken out. And when you look at the economies of the world, let's say the UK is a $3-4 trillion economy. Right? This is 10 years of GDP stolen out of that tiny island.
Correct.
165 million people killed, and in the UK we have a population of 68 million. So imagine wiping out all of the UK 3 generations.
Yeah.
Okay, these are unbelievable figures.
Yeah.
But a powerful India will start to say that, and that causes a great deal of worry.
You know, what they have done recently is that, this is the latest that I've seen, the modus operandi, is that anything that was of genius value that belonged to the Hindu civilization, let's say yoga, Sanskrit, they are now claiming it as theirs. This is the level of shamelessness that these people have. The latest thing that I was reading somewhere is that Panini and Buddha were blonde-haired and blue-eyed people because they're of Aryan race. So yoga is not Hindu, yoga is Aryan. And Sanskrit is Aryan. Well, you don't have any traces of Aryan Sanskrit in your countries, but you have this
The very
here.
word Arya is a Sanskrit word and an indigenous concept. Nobility.
Yeah.
This was Aryabhat, the land of the noble
Correct.
people.
Yes.
So not only did we know what nobility was,
Yeah.
we knew ourselves as noble people.
Yes.
But it comes back to the adhikar.
Yes.
Rather than engaging in a conversation with them,
Yeah.
we need to throw them out of our civilizational home.
The problem, and this is something that I was discussing with a very senior member in the government who was dealing with this, and he said to me that what they do, I said, the professors in the West are now coming and doing this. I said, and the conversation was on about historical truth. We are the only people who say itihas, which is this is how it happened,
Yeah.
itihas,
As it was.
as it was, and that truth. We are the only people who focus on the truth. For everybody else, their religious scriptures, it's women fancy. It changes on the need of the people. The laws are changed depending on, whatever one fancies. And then it is about pushing propaganda. History is not as it was. History is about pushing propaganda.
With motives.
Yes, with motives. And so now the latest propaganda that they're pushing on us is what is indigenous to us, what is our genius, doesn't belong to us. So they're depriving us.
Would you like a simple solution to this for your
Yes.
watchers and observers and so on? The simple solution is this. When 2 people sit together,
Correct.
there is a relationship.
Yeah.
And the relationship is friendly. Sri Krishna ji, he says to Arjuna, he says, I'm sharing this highest of all knowledge with you because you're a friend. Okay?
Yeah.
So there is a relationship between friends and a conversation that can happen between friends.
Correct.
There's a conversation that happens between enemies. There's a conversation that happens between a student and a teacher.
Correct.
They're the conversations. They're the relationships. We need to start looking at which one of those conversations is underway when we are having a conversation.
What does that mean?
So that means when I sit with an Audrey Trushke, and I use that as an example, and my apologies to anybody who's triggered by that example, If I were to sit with Audrey Trushki, I would want to know, is she a friend? Is this conversation a conversation between a student and a teacher? And in which case, who's the student and who's the teacher? What's the nature of this conversation? And the moment I would apply that toolkit to somebody like Stephen Sackur with his hard talk, you suddenly understand the dynamic of what's at play. And it's wrong to treat somebody who is an enemy as a friend. Okay? It's wrong to teach somebody who is actually a student but is behaving like a teacher. Right? When you're the teacher and they're there to learn. And so we need to be clear about the nature of these. And so my toolkit is always study the context, the environmental context of the conversation, of every conversation, and only engage in a conversation according to the rules that have been predetermined for that conversation. If somebody is here to talk about our traditions, then I'm not a student. Okay, I'm a teacher in that space. And if they don't even have the grace of acknowledging their studentship, and the fact that they're to learn something from me about something I've studied for many decades, then they don't deserve they don't have the adhikar, they don't deserve the courtesy. And that's how we should engage in every single conversation.
Okay.
Understand the environmental context.
There's no conversation. These
conversation.
are just rants on Twitter. And if you don't counter these rants, then sooner or later I've noticed that they become mainstream brainwashing propaganda. And so we counter it by mocking them.
So this brings us back to the BBC.
Correct.
Okay. So when I observed that the BBC was actually, one, an active regime change agent, two, not a good faith news broadcaster, and thirdly, an agent of chaos, that is not a good thing. We had to decide what our role was in engaging with this problem. And so we came to the conclusion that a good output would be for the BBC to be known in its true form far and wide. And that would diminish their capacity to create chaos and seed hatred. But the second thing is, because they are not a good faith actor in this country,
Correct.
they have no right to be here.
Yes.
Their adhikar is based on that colonizer.
So you're suggesting
arrogance.
that the BBC should be banned?
Absolutely. Absolutely. In fact, I would suggest that we need to bring them in front of a court of law in Bharat under charges of sedition and regime change and interference in the internal affairs of state of a democratic nation.
Correct.
And they should be required to answer in an Indian court of law.
They should. And
once that's done, it will set a precedent, and the outcome of it would actually be good for them and good for us. We move them from being Gam Earth people to considering actually there's a harmonious way for us to live together and do good work together in the world.
You know, somehow I've noticed that the minute the news agencies are put under law, like Putin has done in Russia, they start to behave themselves.
Yeah.
They stop being regime change operators and they start serving truth to the people. Because now it's all agenda-driven drivel.
Well, there's only one way to deal with a bully.
Yeah.
And I think as a Hindu civilization, we need to accept that we have been culpable in our own misery by allowing bullies free rein to run amok.
Correct. And do you think that has been till now the weakness of the previous leaders, or what? Or is it a collective weakness? Why is that? What is the reason why are we allowing bullies to bully us?
There are so many reasons. Firstly, I have a great deal of tolerance for the weaknesses in our civilization and our societal institutions and structures. There is no other civilization which has been traumatized with the level of violence that we have had, emotional, intellectual and physical violence for the longest period of time. So we're allowed to have rough edges. We're allowed to argue with each other. They're all defensive mechanisms. And we have to find a way to cooperate. And once we find that way of cooperation again, we can then respond to these issues. Now, because we have been civilizationally challenged and our identity has been so deracinated, in order to survive, we had to deny the validity of our own civilization.
That's sad.
Right? In order to survive physically, we had to accept that we were savages. And it takes a long time to heal from that. Normally it'll take 2 to 3 generations. And so we're in that process of recovery. So I have a great deal of latitude within which we argue with each other, we bicker with each other, we find fault with each other. These are all signs of people beginning to speak their truth. Okay, and that's a process.
So the future of India on the recovery track, you're saying?
I look at our civilizational personality as being one struggling with post-traumatic stress disorder. We are struggling with PTSD, and so our healing is actually the same sort of healing that's given to a person who's been in an abusive relationship. Right? Sometimes I look at Britain and their fixation, their obsession with us, and it's like an old flame who was thrown out of a house because they were abusive with us, and they're running around the world bitching and bickering and
The
nitpicking.
narcissist.
That narcissist, that fixation is there.
Yeah, the
They spend
obsession. They
so
get
much time.
obsessed. How did you reject me? The narcissist. Yeah.
And so we have to recognize
Yeah.
that they are an obsessive, abusive relationship. They're like a troublesome ex, engaged in perpetual stalking, and we have to deal with them in that manner.
Yeah. I like the terminology, the perpetual X.
The obsessed perpetual ex.
Obsessed, sorry.
They are civilizational stalkers.
Civilizational.
And this is part of our healing.
Yeah.
Once we understand the nature of the relationship, and we have developed the capacity to articulate to them in their language what's wrong with them, we have a chance to heal them and to heal us.
Yeah, because they're obsessed with us, and they give preferential treatment to Pakistan, despite knowing they are the ones who are raping their daughters on a mass scale. Still, they let them off the hook.
And that's because we haven't yet learned to articulate the truth of that whole situation. Let me share with you a different perspective of what partition was.
Okay.
The way it was sold to us was that the only way these two communities can live together is separated.
Correct.
And so the good-natured people that we are, when brothers fight, the father and mother will say to them, "Chalo, alag kar do." Live together.
Build another floor, split the house.
Split the house. So we bought that.
Yeah.
Okay. Look at it from a slightly different point of view. I always ask, in any change that was implemented, what happened to the Hindus?
Yeah.
That's a simple question to ask. And I was in a conversation where I put forward the proposition that by creating Pakistan, what the British actually did is they extended the history of the Hindukush mountains right the way to Karachi. The killing fields of the Hindukush were extended right the way across the Indus Valley. And that whole Indus Valley became another Hindukush. It became a killing field for the Hindus. And the demographic shift supports that. The violence that was targeted against the Hindus supports that. So the British were not able to claim that we created a peaceful situation.
No.
What they did is they created a Chakravyu within which we as innocent Abhimanyus were slaughtered.
And we were the natives of that land.
And again. And it was the homeland, it was the fountainhead, the source of the Indus Valley civilization, and they gave it away.
Yeah. They did it on purpose.
Well, malice is something that not only can you infer, but the evidence also supports that it was done with the intention.
Another thing, there are three facets to genocide. The first facet is containment, the second facet is dehumanization, and the third facet is extermination. So when you talk of containment, it is actually physical containment. So if you take a look, they divided India not into two, but they divided India into three. So India being in the center, and then Pakistan, East and West Pakistan on the side. What that does is it blocks India because the Himalayas are already on the north.
Oh, sure.
And so ocean is on the south, so you're in between the devil and the deep sea. And so you contained us in this manner on purpose. That generation may not have understood, but this generation is not a fool, and we are not ashamed to say this, what has happened to us. And the second thing that I keep noticing is the dehumanization, whether it is dehumanization of PM Modi, whether it is dehumanization of Hindus as a lot, Hindus as a whole. Even Kumbh, they were not happy with it. They're not happy that so many people have come and they're peacefully doing this. And at the same time, while we are organizing the Kumbh here, there's satellites that are connecting to each other in space. It follows with Modi ji's principle of Vikas Bhi and Virasat bhi,
Virasat,
right?
yeah.
They have a huge problem with it. They're not going to focus on that, the satellites, but they're going to focus on the 2 deaths or the 20, 30 deaths in the stampede, or,
So
or how
here's
the.
an interesting way of looking at that.
Okay.
There's a nursery rhyme
Yeah.
which is taught to children in the United Kingdom,
Yeah.
and it actually stems from the colonial times. It's only 2 or 3 lines, and it describes a centipede
Yeah.
happily walking along with
Yeah.
all of its 100 legs doing what the centipede's legs do.
Yeah.
And the poem actually is, the centipede was happy quite until a toad in fun said, pray which leg comes after which? The centipede lay in a ditch, wondering how to run. Okay? So when something is beautiful and natural and it's just flowing along without thought, there is a toad who comes along to ask, well, how are you doing that? Why are you doing that? Can I see if I can improve it for you? And this toad nature is fundamental to the colonizer mind. They have to interrupt something which is natural. And the Kumbh is a natural expression of the Adhyatmic traditions of our civilization. The broadest and widest gathering of multiple paramparas, with not one of them claiming superiority or hierarchy. People being fed irrespective of who they are and where they have come from.
And very accommodating. Everybody is
Very accommodating, very
Yeah.
supportive of the divinity within each and every one of us.
Yeah.
But Harvard, like the toad,
Yeah.
want to come and study it. They have no adhikar to study it.
Yeah. They should be
Why
banned.
should they be even present?
Yeah.
Right? Why are they going to improve it? Well, the track record that these institutions have is that they don't work for our betterment.
No.
They don't work so they can reproduce and replicate it over in other parts of the world. They are toad minds, as I call them. And we are like the centipede, happy, running along, doing what comes naturally, because we are very much attuned to dharmic natural activity.
And what do you think of this mentality that, and especially certain leaders, their mentality, and also certain people, their mentality that they get so pleased, they're so flattered. Oh, Howard wants to do a study. Well, Howard doesn't want to do a study because you're great. Howard wants to do a study so they can pick on you.
There is a healing process going on. And the sanskar that you acquire when you're younger than the age of about 8 or 9, those sanskars sink deeply into what I call the truth room of your subconscious.
Okay.
It's the understandings that you have upon which you make decisions without calculating, is it right or wrong? They're truths that you assume. And if you've grown up with certain truths, you will make those decisions until you're much older. The previous generation had to survive by adopting certain sanskar.
Okay.
How many people are proud that they went to St. Xavier's School, right? Sanskar. It was seeded that this is an institution of worth and of value. And the reality of St. Xavier's time here is a story that is yet to be told.
Yes.
It was demonic.
Yes.
And yet the sanskar have been seeded, and people are working on those sanskar.
Correct.
So we still have a lot of people who need to revisit the subconscious, the Aegean stables, and perform a Herculean task of cleaning up those stables.
So we are still cleaning up. What do you think is the future of Britain and Europe?
So from a dharmic point of view, karma is unavoidable.
Correct.
Europe, a place of no natural resources, a harsh place, built Fortress Europe on suffering and pain. There is another poem by an English poet called Blake, where he basically wrote, a robin redbreast in a cage sets the heavens in a rage. That even that injustice imbalances the whole of the dharmic process, and it will revert back to try and restore balance. So if you look at the injustices which Europe is responsible for, Fortress Europe built itself on a mountain of suffering, not just human suffering, the suffering of beings all over the world.
Correct.
That's going to come back.
Yeah.
It's unavoidable.
So in how many generations are they going to pay the price? Is this
I think this is the generation. And I think over the next decade, it's going to happen.
Okay.
We are going to see the needs for justice actually manifest in policy choices. Remember, America was a colony.
Yeah.
It was a colony established by people fleeing
Mm.
the excesses of the British Parliament and the
Correct.
ruling monarchy.
Correct.
There was oppression, and it
Yes.
was horrific.
Mm.
There was starvation, there was slavery.
Mm.
It was not a magnanimous, beneficent rulership in Britain. It was
Yeah.
horrible.
Yeah.
And those people fled to the Americas
Correct.
to secure some sort of living quality.
Correct.
So the American psyche
Mm.
is decolonizing.
Yeah.
And so when they turn to Europe,
Yeah.
Donald Trump is, I think, the manifestation of this.
Correct.
He is aware of what people in the Americas fled from.
Yeah.
And so they don't have, other than a ethnic relationship, societally, they don't have a relationship of dependence and respect with Europe.
Correct.
And he articulated it.
Yeah.
Why should we be paying for Europe's mistakes?
That's why he's withdrawing America.
So he's
out of
basically said,
NATO.
I'm going to look after my nation
Yeah.
and my continent.
Mm.
In fact, there is one concern I have, and we'll see whether it plays out, and that is that America will become a Christian nationalist nation.
It is. I think it's.
And
kind
Christian nationalism does not have a good history.
Yeah.
But as a part of that,
Mm.
I think Europe will be abandoned by the American society.
Okay.
They
So,
will say, I'm sorry, we didn't do what you did to the world.
Yeah.
We're not bearing the cost of your karma.
Mm.
And so that leaves Europe in a very confused
Mm.
and compromised manner. Every society has a personality.
Correct.
And the European personality is actually subliminally aware of a sense of guilt.
Yes.
And that guilt needs to be purged.
Mm.
In fact, one of my projects, which I will share and announce it with you now,
Yeah.
is to establish a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, Dharma, Truth and Reconciliation, which will allow this generation of the descendants of colonizers to speak to this generation of the colonized with an intention to come to a reconciled future. That has to happen. We have never engaged in that.
Yeah.
And yet we need a Truth and Reconciliation
We do.
process.
We do.
And it's something that I've already established.
We need to hold people accountable. If our forefathers could not hold their forefathers accountable, we need to hold them accountable.
But the dharmic approach is to demand accountability and to insist upon it, but with an intention of moving towards reconciliation.
Yeah, the thing is that we don't want you to pay for it. We at least want you to accept
Well,
it.
I wouldn't go that far. All right? There is still a Punjabi in me which says, "Nahi,
pay for it."
chukana hoga." Right?
Okay.
We want that Kohinoor.
Okay, no.
Amongst other things.
Amongst other, what you have looted from us needs to be given back to us.
Well,
No.
there's a lot of research to be done
Correct.
before we can quantify it.
Yeah.
And we've already done a lot of research.
Yeah.
And so what I want is a process, and this is what we're initiating in our Truth and Reconciliation Committee,
Okay.
is a process of research and then recognition.
Okay.
All parties to any event have to recognize the reality of what happened.
Yeah.
After recognition, there's an opportunity for remorse, where those people who have benefited from what was done by their ancestors express remorse for it. And then there is an agreed mechanism for restitution. What can we do to restore harmony and to, as an act of justice, what can we do? And only then, after reparation or restitution, do you move towards a reconciliation. Now, we have made the mistake in the past in that we have engaged with people who have done us harm, and they want us to leap from research to reconciliation. They don't want to go through the middle processes.
Yeah.
But the middle processes are absolutely vital. We have to have the research.
You spoke about multiculturalism. Is that a result of multiculturalism, or is that a result of their lack of empathy, or
It's
their
a strategy.
Their desire to stay in power? Doesn't matter if the people they invite for them to be powerful are raping their own daughters. What is it?
So now, I'm so pleased you brought that up,
Yeah.
because we are hearing in the mainstream media, multiculturalism has failed.
Yeah.
Okay? And it sounds as though it's the voice of the people. It actually isn't. Right? It's a strategy. There is one community and a subset of that community who have caused such harm that it has brought instability and fear into the whole of British society. But rather than identifying that one community, it's the Asian phenomenon.
Mm.
The government and the media are now saying multiculturalism has failed.
Mm.
Yeah,
Oh.
Asians are responsible.
Oh.
Okay?
Huh.
And so they are seeding an environment
Uh-huh.
in which the indigenous population will accept that multiculturalism has failed.
No, it hasn't.
And so all of a sudden, you
Yeah.
see what they will then paint as, this is the rise of the far right.
Ah.
This is white racism beginning to express itself, but it's being nurtured and seeded. Fortunately, the vast majority of the English community are saying, well, hang on a minute, we love the Hindu community,
Yeah.
right? They have not done us any harm. We love the Sikh community.
Mm.
It's not Buddhists who are going around driving vehicles into cars.
Yeah.
We love them. Wonderful food. We enjoy their festivities and their celebrations, their commitment to the armed forces.
Yeah.
They're all part of our society. The Chinese are not doing this.
Yeah.
The Vietnamese are not doing this. The Thai are not doing this.
Correct.
So who is doing this? One community.
Yeah.
And yet the government is now, the mainstream is promoting the idea that multiculturalism has failed. And so we have to respond to that and say, actually, you're about to be encouraged to throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Correct.
And that's not really the valid approach. I mean, I say this to our Hindus in the United Kingdom and elsewhere,
Yeah.
we have 4 generations of investment in these countries. Right? When we set up our homes there, these countries were genuinely racist. They were genuinely white supremacist. We grew up with that in the 60s. We encountered the real far right.
Correct.
And now, after 3 generations of work and investment, helping build economies, helping build schools and build houses, right? You're now telling us that we're part of a problem. I'm sorry, we don't accept that.
On that, I remember you've also mentioned that the white man speaks with forked tongues. Can you tell us why you said
So
this?
that wasn't me.
Yeah, it wasn't you.
It was,
you were quoting somebody.
Yeah, Chief Sitting Bull
Okay.
in America. There were 443 treaties signed between the white man and the indigenous people. 443 treaties.
Okay.
All of them were broken by the white man.
Wow.
Okay?
So they never keep the promises.
And so he said that a white man speaks with a forked tongue. And that was his observation at that time. And if you have a look at the regime change operations engaged in by the BBC, there is enough evidence to support that actually, in Punjabi we say kutte di pooch jo hai.
Seedhi nahi hoti.
And so there is an element of perhaps some aspect of that still present. But remember, the power structures are as hostile to their own indigenous population as they are to everyone else. You know, they say kisi ke sakhe nahi hai.
Kisi ke sagge nahi hai. You've also mentioned about the youth of Bharat, and so how do you see?
So we have a completely different way of looking at existence, and we don't have the notion of good and bad in the same way that they have it in the West. We look at things as a flow, and there is no action which can be labeled as good or as bad, because every action is part of this flow. So we don't have this amateurish understanding of a sinner and a saint and people being, you know, sinners by birth and all of that sort of stuff. We don't. We see the flow. And that is a much healthier way of looking at the world. So when I look at the youth of Bharat, I see a flow occurring already. It's not enough for them to receive hard, fast beliefs. Something deep inside of them says, I don't want to believe something I don't understand. So they're questioning, whereas in the past, our previous generations had to believe in order to survive.
So how do you see the role of the youth of Bharat over the next decade?
I'm really excited. In fact, I engage with an awful lot of youngsters, and they have that relentless pursuit of reason. They say, make me understand, right? Which is wonderful. Isn't that the whole purpose of Gyan Yoga and the way in which we have a manthan between scholars? And our youngsters are in that space.
Chapter 4 of the Gita.
Completely.
Gyan Yoga, yeah.
And so long as we have the capacity to engage with them happily and mischievously in this churn and this dance, and we abandon the idea, you know, we don't do that anymore. Just believe it is not enough.
Correct.
We have to engage with them and give them the understanding that they yearn. And never before Have we had the capacity to share in this dance of search for wisdom like we have now? You know, I see so many of them speaking and asking questions. They've watched something on YouTube. It didn't quite fit in. And they have the courage to ask the question.
Which is good.
We need the courage to be able to say, well, here's something. It's an opportunity for us to expand and give them a perspective which they can or cannot accept. It's up to them.
Yeah.
There is no violence in intellect nor in emotion in the way in which we teach. We have to rise to that challenge. But I have never come across a generation which is so well equipped to restore dharmic balance, not just to Bharat, but to the whole world as this generation.
And
They're
so-
marvelously equipped.
Yeah, and so how would you, you're a wise man yourself, you are a Pandit, you work, you're a Dharmic scholar, you were with the Royal Asiatic Society. Other normal parents don't have this, neither do teachers, they're not equipped either. What would be your teaching to them, or what would be your advice to them? How will they rise up to the challenge of the youth of this country and the questions that they have to ask?
So I'm often asked this question by parents.
Okay.
And I say to them that our youth, our Sanatani youngsters, are the greatest hypocrisy detectors I've ever come across. Okay? And you can't give a person something you don't have.
Correct.
So number one is, if you are a member of the Sanatani tradition, do your sadhana
Correct.
and watch it unfold inside of you. Read the Gita 6 times from end to end and not talking about it, and see how it starts to unfold inside of you. Why are you missing the opportunity for your own dharmic evolution by delegating it to somebody else, when if you do it, your children will also respect you for it, and they will say, I want to be like that person. You know, Dharma Vidya, it's not just educational, it's transformational.
Correct.
Its real purpose is to allow divinity to manifest in each and every one of us. And so if it's taught and transferred properly, the person who receives it evolves. And where do they evolve to? Arya. We have to encourage our children to become Arya. And if parents do not embody nobility, the children don't want it.
In fact, that reminds me, it was around 10, 11, I don't know, it was maybe 2012, 13. I used to live abroad and I came to India, and I remember going to an ATM because I had no access to cards or anything, so I had to withdraw money all the time. And when I entered that ATM, I saw the security guard of the ATM sitting in a corner, and in front of him, he had a shikha as well. He's sitting in a corner, and I was very surprised to find he was reading the Gita. I have never seen somebody just sitting in his peaceful time reading the Gita. And I said to him, why are you reading the Gita? And, because most of the time they are, doing, a lot of times nowadays, parents are either watching TV, scrolling Facebook, or, doing these kind of things. And I was so surprised. There's this wise man sitting here. And he said, he looked at me. He was very surprised somebody asked him that question, or somebody even noticed him like that. And he said to me, "Jo hai, wo sab isi mein hai."
Jo isme nahi hai.
And I was so surprised. He says, "Jo hai, wo sab isi mein hai." I mean, the wisdom of that man, I was
We have so much to share.
Yeah.
You know, it's almost as though we come into this existence, we open our eyes, we're here.
Yeah.
We have 2 choices.
Yeah.
One is we can take a left turn.
Yeah.
One is we can take a right turn.
Yeah.
If you take a left turn, you go out into the world of sensation.
Yeah.
And you're seeking Anand through external forces.
Yeah.
If you take a right turn, you find that Anand is experienced inside this space.
Correct.
And so we sat quietly and we thought, where is that Anand center in a human being? And we found that center. And if you find that center, you don't need what's outside there.
In fact, the reason I said that is that I was surprised, and that's why the contrast I'm drawing in between parentage and how lucky the children of such a father are, who recognizes the importance of Gita, because what he learns, then he's going to impart it in his life, and that's the lesson he's going to give his children, and how blessed his lineage may be.
So that's the first rule. If, as a parent, you want your children to follow an adhyatmic path, you have to have it.
Correct.
Children look for role models.
Yes.
And can you imagine if all of our parents, once they've recovered from the horrors of being colonized, regain their Arya status?
Correct.
That they walk tall, they walk proud,
Mm.
without having to oppress anybody else,
Mm.
but just content in the knowledge that they are an incredibly divine creation.
Mm.
Children will look and say, I want what that person has got.
Correct.
It's that simple.
Yeah.
I want what that person has got. And if you are incredibly educated,
Mm.
but you don't have any sense of personal nobility,
Mm.
and you may have wealth and fancy cars and everything else,
Mm.
our children are not impressed.
Yeah.
So the first rule for parents is take the opportunity of a birth in this human form
Mm.
and acquire your own evolution, become Arya,
Correct.
and then your children will want to have that.
Correct.
And our tradition, our teachers also need to enable that.
Mm-hmm.
They need to embody it,
Mm-hmm.
because there's no point in being the head of a matta and children look and say, God, that person is so unhealthy, right? Or it doesn't look cool, you know, whatever he's got, I don't really want to end up like that.
I'm not impressed by
We're
that.
making a fundamental mistake.
Correct.
And this is actually a really important notion,
Mm.
because there are teachers of adharma
Mm.
who have learned
Mm.
that if they project nobility,
Mm.
despite themselves being the most ignoble of people,
Mm-hmm.
people will buy it and gravitate
Correct.
towards them.
Yeah.
So we need to recover that. Once we
Yeah.
recover that, and I see it happening, in fact, amongst many of our youth,
Mm-hmm.
they are recovering that instinctive sense that actually we were noble people.
Yeah.
Once they recover that, you watch, we will change the world.
You know, in your book, you also mentioned about Dalits and how they were created, Dalits and untouchables. Who created them and how? Can you tell us about that?
So again, this was me on my search for historical evidence.
Mm.
If all of the Shastra and all of the history that we have, the Itihasa that we have, says that everyone is born with an innate divinity,
Mm.
and that there is nobody born
Mm-hmm.
in a lower status.
Yeah.
We recognize that. Where did they come from?
Mm.
And so I was looking for that moment in history
Mm.
which created a subclass
Mm-hmm.
and imprisoned them in that subclass and denied them access to respect, resources,
Mm-hmm.
and freedoms. When did it happen?
Yeah.
And the catalyst for that moment, the major shift,
Mm-hmm.
was the 1871 Criminal Tribes Act.
Okay.
So this was an act that was introduced by the British,
Mm-hmm.
and it was introduced on the premise, they said, that there are persons and tribes in this country who are born criminal. They will live as criminals, they will die as criminals, and their children will be criminals. Okay? And when we identify those groups, we have to imprison them, we have to incarcerate them, we have to confine them.
Okay.
This was the premise, this was the actual articulation in the Act. And the driver behind it was actually taxation.
Oh.
They looked for every opportunity to tax.
Correct.
And so any community which represented a challenge to the British hegemony was easy to put a tick and say, this is a criminal tribe.
Mm.
And I'll give you an example. We used to have caravans, merchant caravans, who would take goods manufactured in one city, take them to the markets where they were to be sold and give them to the traders, receive the money and come back and pay the manufacturers.
Correct.
And these were held in high regard because they were entrusted
Yes.
with a whole year's worth of production.
Correct.
And the British wanted to transact and inflict a tax on the movement of goods. So they designated that whole tribe as a criminal tribe. And they would then imprison them and confine them in what I call concentration camps attached to villages. And they did this with other tribes who were Kshatriyas, who were challenging British hegemony.
Yeah.
They would say it's a criminal tribe, seize all their assets. And they'd worked out a mechanism of creating a compound near villages where these people were confined. And one example I came across was that the Muslims also had a policy of doing this. At one point in time, they decided that rather than just killing all these people, we had to break their resolve. Right? We've killed enough of them. They're still saying we refuse to convert. Right? So we want to destroy their resolve. And so those who refuse to convert and who would worship Gaumata, the only job that they were allowed to do was to trade in the skins and the carcasses of Gaumata. So they reduced them into what they became known derogatory as Jamars.
Yeah.
Right? And yet many of them only one generation ago, had an association with Kshatriya families.
Yeah.
And I have records of where this was done. And so the British amplified that and created these concentration camps. And if a person from a criminal tribe wanted to move, he had to go to the head man of the village or the town and get a pass to leave their compound, give reasons, and then come back. They weren't allowed to hold assets. They weren't allowed to trade in anything except leather, tanning, carcasses. And in 1947, when the British left, I think I found a record that there were 13 million people who were criminal tribes or the descendants of criminal tribes imprisoned, in essence, in these little communities and compounds.
And how conveniently they've changed the narrative. Yeah.
The truth is that when the British arrived in Bharat, of these 600 plus principalities and kingdoms, over 2/3 were actually ruled over by Shudra kings and queens.
Correct, I'm aware of that.
You know, Rani Rajmohini, who built Dakshineshwar Mandir, she was from a Shudra community, and yet she was a queen. And so there was a massive transfer of assets from the Shudra communities to the British government. And then the British government, in their classic manner, spanned the story that this is going back into your ancestry.
And that the Brahmins made you do that.
And the Brahmins made you do that.
Yeah.
You know, I often ask,
what was their problem with the Brahmins?
witches,
You
witch doctors,
Yeah.
Brahmins, anybody who was a wisdom tradition was a threat to a hegemony based on belief systems. And they would identify them very clearly. And I've often said to people who try and convince me that there was a hierarchy, I say, if you have a hierarchy, you have to have a unit of measurement. You have to have a metric.
Correct.
So on what metric
Yeah.
were the Brahmins high? You call about high caste. I want a measurement. Is it inches? Is it centimeters? Is it money? Is it ownership of land? What is it? There is no consistent metric except one. And the only metric that exists is that they were the highest threat to British Christian hegemony. And that's why they were labeled as high caste.
And they were the highest threat, and also they stood in between conversions.
Yeah.
And I remember listening to you on Clubhouse many years ago.
My goodness, that was a long time ago.
Yeah, I know. I've been following you since then. And you mentioned that the British labeled the Brahmins as high caste because the Brahmins were more respected than the British. So they were very threatened by that because everybody would come and touch the feet of the Brahmin, but not the British. And so they're voluntarily doing that, but they're not giving me the salute that I want. I remember you saying something like this on these lines.
Yeah. I mean, recognize that the idea of a caste system was actually very British. It was very Christian.
Yeah.
And when they came into India, the reality of the caste system is they wanted to be the high caste.
Correct.
Right? Wherever they want, they wanted to be the high caste.
And here the Brahmins
the
are.
recipients of respect and the repository of power.
Yeah.
The lawmakers.
Yeah.
And yet there was a competing group in this society, a kinship group, who actually garnered more respect than indeed the British did.
Yeah.
And that was not possible. So they did everything in their power first to vilify, to disempower this particular kinship group.
Yeah.
And it was sustained. And most people don't know, but the very first regiment that the British created was actually called the 1st Brahmin Regiment.
Oh, wow. In the army, you mean?
In the army.
Wow, okay.
In the army.
Yeah.
But the Brahmins were not so susceptible to being deceived that they then decided, hang on a minute, we've got insurrections happening, let's break them up.
Yeah.
And rather than having them in terms of their kinship groups, we want to mix them.
So
and
what
so
did
they
they
then
do?
started to create other regiments.
Okay.
But the first one was the 1st Brahmin regiment.
You know, you in your book you've also highlighted, or was it already highlighted, the quote by the Reverend Joseph Roberts on caste. And you've mentioned that, you know, it's already there, the solemn fact that next to the love of sin, caste is a great barrier in the Indian betwixt the pagans and Christ.
So caste is the greatest barrier betwixt the pagan and Christ.
Yeah.
So 1813 was when William Wilberforce successfully managed to get the charter of the East India Company to have a clause added to it called the Pious Clause, which now meant that it became a duty of the British going to India to Christianize it.
Oh.
So that happened in 1813, and it was after Hinduphobia had been seeded throughout the English population.
Okay.
Hatred and contempt for the indigenous Hindus and their traditions. Between 1813 and 1844, there were attempts to Christianize and convert, and they weren't successful. Time and time again, they were coming across people who were saying, well, actually, we're happy with our worship, right? So each subgroup, each kinship group, each jati group had its own way of worshipping. So those who were the Khans or working with carpentry and things like that, they would worship Vishwakaranji, and they would revere their tools and implements. So they had their own tightly knit communities, and each community was engaged in worship according to its own laws and rules, and the British couldn't break into it. And so in 1844, they held a conference and got all the missionary orders together and said, guys, it's not working out, we have to find a solution to this. And they openly acknowledged that the Jati Varna system, they called it this incredible institution of India. And they articulated the one thing betwixt Christ and these pagans, and I'm quoting verbatim, is this incredible institution of India. So they knew that in order to break and rule in this country, they had to use divide and rule. And so they set about it with a particular, the British have a particularly focused way of targeting and planning violence, right? So what, I think 50,000 Brits maximum at any one time in this country, ruled over 330 million.
Correct.
And it's because they had mastered the act of coordinated application of violence. Ice cold planning, adherence, and in Lagan it's really articulated very well, the movie. But that's how they mastered this, the controlled application of violence. And so when they'd set about ruling this country, they knew they had to denigrate its religious traditions. They created a link between Shastra and between this Jati Varna construct, and then they created the oppressor and the oppressed framework, which is classic divide and rule.
Correct.
And then they implemented it. And they implemented it so successfully that after one generation, it's normally a 3-generation process, this. You target one generation with violence, burn all the witches. And the youngsters who are growing up watching this imbibe that horror. They become traumatized by it, and so they become crushed. The 3rd generation, who they have no notion of what was done to 2 generations before. They have learned what the 2nd generation had to learn in order to survive, and it becomes natural for them. It becomes sanskar.
Yeah.
And so that's what they set about doing here. And so we now have a whole generation who learned from the previous generation. Remember, we're in the 3rd generation now.
Correct.
Right? What was taught to us, St. Xavier's is wonderful.
Yeah.
Right? And Mira Yisu, whatever it is, all this stuff that's going on.
Yeshu. That boy has now gone and said that he was given some rice and some money to say what he said.
But I have a great deal of faith that we're a wisdom tradition. It's still vibrating in our genes and our DNA, that we don't force a belief on anybody, and that we were not responsible for the suffering that we went through for almost 180 years.
Yeah.
This is becoming apparent. We're learning to articulate it. We're learning to reassert that freedom of wisdom, freedom of thought and freedom of speech is a higher value system than freedom of religion and belief.
Okay.
And that is something that our next generation, I think, would agree with.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. Thank you for coming here and giving us so much of the wisdom that you carry with you.
It's been a pleasure to share with you. But I have an advantage, you see.
Yeah.
All of you are living in the land of Dharma.
Correct.
Whereas I grew up and developed an understanding in the land of Adharma. And so I know the value of what exists here because I have lived and grown without it. And I think it would be wonderful to see this generation reconnect with that wisdom.
Okay.
And the work that you are doing and the work that your colleagues are doing is reaching more people than we've ever been able to reach before in the shortest space of time. And if you continue, and I'm confident that you will, we will see a reversal within a decade of harm that was accumulated over centuries.
And I think that healing, that time for healing is here, and to
It is.
reverse the harm and to heal.
It is. And we will do it in a dharmic manner,
Correct.
as we are seeing Prime Minister Modi ji do in a dharmic manner within the confines of the legislative and judicial systems that have been inherited.
Yes.
But I'm very positive about the future and look forward to seeing how this develops and being a small part of this renaissance.
Okay.
So thank you very much.
Jai Shri Ram.
Jai Shri Ram.